Hi everyone, welcome back to the second installment of this season's Prairie Wonderland. It is part of the ongoing Lessons with Laura series. If you're new here, my name is Laura Ingalls Gunn. Now, this is actually Thanksgiving week in the United States. And one thing that I love about the Ingalls and Pioneer families in general is they truly celebrated each season. So when it was the harvest, they celebrated the harvest. And I try to do that in my own home as well. Every holiday is fully celebrated with decorations, and I am old school in that the Thanksgiving dishes have to be washed and put away before I start decorating my Christmas tree. And I leave it up through the full 12 days of Christmas. So this week, we are going to be reading from Little Town on the Prairie. If you have never read the Thanksgiving story in this book, it is just so wonderful and mouth-watering. And from this, we are going to attempt to make Ma's enormous pumpkin pie, and that should be a lot of fun. Now, there is a cookbook, the Little House Cookbook, that does have a pumpkin pie recipe, and I have made that in a previous video from a few years ago, and I will link down below to the website where you can get that recipe if you'd like to try it for yourself. So I was looking for something different, and Laura often wrote about some of the ladies' magazines of the day. Godey's or Godey's, depending on how you pronounce it, was very popular. But in looking for a Thanksgiving recipe from one of those women's magazines, I came across a magazine that somehow, in my many years around the sun, I did not know existed, and it is Ingalls Home Magazine. Now, this particular book, what the publishers would do is every year they would also offer up all 12 issues in one hardbound book. And the one that I found is from 1888. Now, I had to go down a little bit of a rabbit hole in learning about Ingalls Home Magazine. And it was started by a gentleman in 1887. And each month it would have recipes, housekeeping, child rearing, not so much in terms of patterns, but there were a few fashions that were offered. And then in 1895, Mr. Ingalls sold it to Modern Priscilla. So it was only in production for 8 years. And if you go on eBay and Etsy. You can get singular issues of the magazine, as well as some of the hardbound books. So I'm sort of on a mission now that I want all 8 of the annual books of Ingalls Home Magazine. So we'll see if I'm lucky. You know, anybody who is a collector, I'm sure understands. But in terms of was Ingalls, and he lived in Massachusetts. It was J.F. Ingalls who was the publisher. Now, was he related to Charles and Caroline and their girls? Quite possibly. And since this is Thanksgiving, it's fun to talk about that Laura's 7th great-grandfather was a man named Richard Warren. And Richard Warren was one of the individuals who came over from England on the Mayflower. So Laura can trace her lineage to her 7th great-grandfather. Richard Warren is my 10th great-grandfather. So that's kind of neat that in celebrating the harvest and the Puritans that came over on the Mayflower. There is, of course, other aspects that we need to focus on. The kindness of the Native Americans that helped those people that came over on the Mayflower. Without them, all of those passengers would have absolutely perished without their assistance. So we need to take time during the holiday to be grateful to the Native Americans. But this was a very, very neat special treat. When I purchased this off of eBay, I wanted it in an auction. I'm one of those that's kind of, oftentimes if there's a lot of interest, I'm a last minute swooper. I know it's horrible, but nobody wanted this. And I was the sole bidder. So I was extremely happy about that. And then, again, this is from 1888, and the individual, she obviously really treasured this book because she put her signature in full, and it's Lucy C. Abernathy. And what I really loved, which is such a God wink or a glimmer, whatever you choose. You know, I really wanted to see a pie recipe, and that's why I particularly bought this one. But Miss Abernathy, this was her Thanksgiving menu, and she was gonna start out with a cream soup, and she was gonna have boiled potatoes and a brown sauce, baked sweet potatoes, whipped potatoes, beet, scalloped chicken, celery and cheese, orange pudding, almond cake, and other garnishes. So she, and she even wrote, you know, that it was from page 18. So it says here on page 18, the Thanksgiving Day menu. And there was even more. You know, during the Victorian era, you had numerous courses. A celebratory dinner like this would easily last 2 and 3 hours. You know, people would come together as they do today from near and far. And so they would gather around the table and tell stories and perhaps play games in between courses. So it was a really wonderful coming together. So let me read you the full menu. It's raw oysters on the half shell, cream soup, boiled fish, egg sauce, boiled potatoes, roast turkey, brown sauce, cranberry jelly, baked sweet potatoes, whipped white potatoes, mashed turnips, beets, scalloped chicken, celery, cheese, mince pie, orange pudding, fruit, pumpkin pie, almond cake, raisins, nuts, and coffee. And then it goes step by step how to prepare each item in the book. So this just tickled me to no end that I really wanted this so I could get the pumpkin pie recipe, but that Lucy Abernathy wanted it for the same thing, and that was for her Thanksgiving dinner in 1888. Now, let's get to this week's reading, and it's a little bit longer today, so find your coziest chair. We are going to be reading from chapter 19 in the book, and it is titled The Whirl of Gaiety. And I'm actually going to start at the bottom of page 226. So it's a few pages into the chapter. As if all this were not more than enough, the Ladies' Aid planned a great celebration of Thanksgiving to help pay for the church. It was to be a New England supper. Laura rushed home from school to help Ma peel and slice and stew down the biggest pumpkin that Pa had raised last summer. She carefully picked over and washed a whole quart of small white navy beans too. Ma was going to make a mammoth pumpkin pie and the largest milk pan full of baked beans to take to the New England supper. There was no school on Thanksgiving Day. There was no Thanksgiving dinner either. I'm going to stop for a moment. During this time, the noontime meal was referred to as dinner. Today, we sometimes call it lunch. So there was no lunch on this day. It was a queer, blank day full of anxious watching of the pie and the beans and of waiting for the evening. In the afternoon, they all took turns bathing in the washtub in the kitchen by daylight. It was so strange to bathe by daylight and on a Thursday. Then Laura carefully brushed her school dress and brushed and combed and braided her hair and curled her bangs afresh. Ma dressed in her second best, and Pa trimmed his whiskers and put on his Sunday clothes. And I live across the street from a fire department. Do we leave it in? Yes, let's just do it because real life needs to be celebrated. At lamp lighting time, when they were all hungry for supper, Ma wrapped the great pan of beans in brown wrapping paper and a shawl to keep the beans hot, while Laura bundled Grace into her wraps and hurried into her own coat and hood. Pa carried the beans. Ma bore in both hands the great pumpkin pie baked in her large, square bread baking tin. Laura and Carrie carried between them a basket full of Ma's dishes, and Grace held on to Laura's other hand. As soon as they passed the side of Fuller's store, they could see, across the vacant lots behind it, the church blazing with light. Wagons and teams and saddle ponies were already gathering around it. All the bracket lamps on the inside walls of the church were lighted. Their glass bowls were full of kerosene, and their light shone dazzling bright from the tin reflectors behind their clear glass chimneys. All the benches had been set back against the walls, and two long, white-covered tables stretched glittering down the middle of the room. "Ooh, look!" Carrie cried out. Laura stood stock still for an instant. Even Pa and Ma almost halted, though they were too grown up to show surprise. A grown-up person must never let feelings be shown by voice or manner. So Laura only looked and gently hushed Grace, though she was as excited and overwhelmed as Carrie was. In the very center of one table, a pig was standing, roasted brown, and holding in its mouth a beautiful red apple. Above all the delicious scents that came from those tables rose the delicious smell of roast pork. In all their lives, Laura and Carrie had never seen so much food. Those tables were loaded. There were heaped dishes of mashed potatoes and mashed turnips and mashed yellow squash, all dribbling melted butter down their sides from the little hollows in their peaks. There were large bowls of dried corn, soaked soft again and cooked with cream. There were plates piled high with golden squares of cornbread and slices of white bread and brown, nutty-tasting graham bread. There were cucumber pickles and beet pickles and green tomato pickles. Oh, and glass bowls on tall glass stems were full of red tomato preserves and wild chokeberry jelly. On each table was a long, wide, deep pan of chicken pie with steam rising through the slits in its flaky crust. Most marvelous of all was the pig. It stood so lifelike, propped up by short sticks above a great pan filled with baked apples. Oh, it smelled so good. Better than any smell of any other food was that rich, oily brown smell of roasted pork that Laura had not smelled for so long. You know, again, during Laura's time, food was not as abundant as what we have today. You know, so to see that much food, and Laura had written about one other Thanksgiving, which was more modest. You know, I certainly won't make that much food for my Thanksgiving dinner, but there's absolutely elements that I still serve that's very similar to that menu. I usually create a big egg casserole, and then I have another dish of baked apples and some sort of sweet bread that I make for breakfast. And just like the Ingalls family, we won't have lunch or dinner, as some people call it, that day. Instead, it'll be an early supper. And we will have a small ham, and we'll have a roasted turkey and mashed potatoes. And we do dressing. Some people do stuffing. And what is the difference? Well, stuffing goes into the cavity of the turkey, whereas dressing is cooked separately in the oven in a pan. And we have mashed potatoes and sweet potatoes and cranberry jelly. And I think it's next week's episode, I am going to show you how to make Laura's cranberry jelly. That is something that I serve for Thanksgiving as well as Christmas dinner. So even though we'll be past Thanksgiving, we will be having that recipe in the Prairie Wonderland series. Now, all this talk of food, I am absolutely starving. I think we ought to go into the kitchen and make Ma's Mammoth pumpkin pie. And the recipe that I selected, I was going for a large quantity of ingredients, which once we get into the kitchen, you're going to be going, oh my goodness. So let's head into the kitchen. I am really excited to try and make this particular pumpkin pie recipe. When I came across it, at first I thought it was a misprint, and no, there is one ingredient that, yes, you need that much of it. So it was just super, super crazy. And so it is Monday when I am filming this, Monday of Thanksgiving week, and my son is coming home from college, and this is perfect timing. He absolutely loves pumpkin pie. He does not want to eat it just on Thanksgiving. He wants pumpkin pie all throughout the month of November and December. So as much as he's coming home to celebrate the holiday, his coming home for me as a mom is a celebration too. So for this particular pumpkin pie recipe, we need 1.5 cups of cooked pureed pumpkin. So that's that ingredient right here. Once I measured it out, it's basically 1 15-ounce can of pumpkin puree. Now I selected an organic so that it would be more in tune to what Caroline's pumpkin puree would have tasted like. I know, I probably should have gone to the pumpkin patch and slow cook the pumpkin all day. I just don't have time. God bless her that she did that. That's amazing. And maybe one year I will try making my pumpkin puree from scratch, but not this year. Next ingredient is 2/3 cup of brown sugar. And again, when you're measuring it out, you really want to pack that down for your sugar. I put it into a prettier container, which is why it's not quite so packed down. And the recipe calls for 1 teaspoon of salt. Now I'm using sea salt, which is more what would have been available in the 1870s, 1880s. Table salt is a little bit less flavorful. So, in terms of modern day measurements. If you're using table salt, you may want to add a smidge more, but I'd hate for the pie to turn out too salty. So sometimes when you're transferring ingredients, because of how they have changed over the years, it can affect the taste. For the spices, you will want 1 teaspoon of ground nutmeg and 1 teaspoon of ground cinnamon. You'll also need 1½ cups of milk. Now, I'm assuming that this was probably whole milk that they were using. We primarily use low-fat milk in our house, so again, fingers crossed that this is gonna turn out. If it doesn't, that may be an area that if I ever tried this recipe again, whole milk might make the difference. 2 teaspoons of orange juice, if you can see that. And you know, I love adding a touch of orange to autumnal recipes. It's something about it brings out the flavors of the pumpkin and the spices. Now, the one ingredient that made me say, was it calls for 12 eggs. Yes, 12 eggs, slightly beaten. That's a lot of eggs. But, you know, the grand thing about that is this will cause this pumpkin pie to have a lot of protein, because I'll tell you, you know when I love to eat pumpkin pie? For breakfast. And so now with this recipe, I have no guilt. I mean, there's milk and there's pumpkin puree and orange juice and egg. Hey, that's breakfast in my book. And I am gonna go ahead and beat the eggs and get the roast chicken going in the oven, because a housewife pioneer, she would have definitely, if she needed a higher temp, which this recipe does start out at 425 degrees, and then it gets lowered to 300 degrees after 10 minutes. To get the heat that high, she would have been cooking probably more than 1 dish. So in the spirit of maximizing oven heat, you know, I'm going to start out by roasting the chicken while I prepare the pumpkin. And so I'm going to turn the camera off so I can whip the eggs really quickly and grab my pastry for my pie that's been chilling in the refrigerator. And pastry making in and of itself is an art form. I'm not going to go into that in this video. Also, because I don't eat gluten, this is a pie shell that is made from a mixture of cassava and almond flour, which it is a little bit of a different taste. That if you can eat gluten, do the traditional. You know, my mom made pie crusts from the recipe on the side of the Crisco can. It was so flaky and delicious. Do that. All right, so at Thanksgiving, I always use this vintage pie dish because it's just a beautiful autumnal color. I just love it. And for cleanup, I always place my pie on a cookie sheet in case it boils over. So that'll help you with any spillage problems. And you can hear my oven, it's preheating. It's a strange oven that it uses a cooling method with a fan. And you can see that I've slightly beaten eggs. And then from here, we're just basically adding in the ingredients and then mixing them in. Now, I'm thinking I've made a second pie shell, and that's probably good because I'm already looking at this. I think for this size pie, it's probably gonna make 2 pies, which in my house, that is not a bad thing at all. I'm a little bit nervous about trying to, and again, clean hands are important in the kitchen, about trying to pour this mixture. So I'm just gonna whisk it to get it kind of incorporated. Hopefully, it doesn't splash all over. So I'll probably move the antique book out of the splash zone. And the cinnamon always wants to fight, like it's sort of clumpy. And I think, you know, maybe if I was going to use a mixture with other spices, you could add ginger. Ginger would be delicious, but I love cinnamon and nutmeg in my pumpkin pie. And so I'm just gonna I am trying to do it in the spirit of somewhat pioneering. I mean, I'm not cooking over a hearth. I have a modern oven, but you know, there's certain things, especially if you're going to ask your kids to help in the kitchen, which, you know, pull up that chair. That is so important. I cooked with both of my children from a very young age, and they both love to cook today, and they're actually really good cooks. My daughter is probably a better cook than I am. Okay, so can you see that? Now, I'm nervous because I am hoping that these eggs are gonna set up. This is really soupy. Fingers crossed. So let's go ahead and slowly pour it in. Slowly. Guess what? It's gonna make 2 pies. Okay, that means I've got to get the other pie. Another pie will fit on here. So let me grab that second pie crust. I always make a double batch because I thought, oh, it's Thanksgiving week, I'll be making another pie, and it keeps really well in the freezer. So I'm gonna pull that out really quick. I think I now know how Mom made one enormous pumpkin pie. Yeah, you see it kind of spilled over here. It not only filled up the second pie crust, but I'm just gonna go ahead and cook it as custard alone, which it tastes delicious. And these are just canning jars, so they can withstand that heat. And then that way I'll be able to screw a lid on them, and yummy with granola or over oatmeal for breakfast, because I didn't want to waste one drop. But you can see that I have filled these to the brim, and I am going to have to very carefully carry them over to the oven. So again, the oven's at 425, and we're going to cook them for 10 minutes. And that's just to really get the pastry going. And then there's our grace, shake, rattle, and roll. Then after 10 minutes, we're going to lower the temperature to 300 for 45 minutes. And I'll have the Celsius conversion up here in the corner because I have been able to see that some of you, even over in England, France, Germany, and Italy, are watching these videos, which that's amazing. That's amazing. A few Canadian viewers too. So thank you so much. I'm going to put these in the oven. Several stories in the Little House series talk about what was needed during harvest time and how to prepare for winter. Now, that's a concept that today we're not really familiar with because we can go to the grocery store anytime that we want. But in the 1870s and 1880s, particularly the pioneers who were very far away from cities and towns, they had to can and jelly fruits and vegetables. They had to either smoke, salt, or freeze meat that would carry them through for several months. And also too, in specifically preparing for the holidays for hundreds of years, people have been, in essence, decking the halls with boughs of holly. And not just holly, but evergreens. And some of the reasons that they did that is because, as I'm sure you're aware, during the winter months, it's often overcast, perhaps even gloomy. So by bringing in fresh greens and red berries, it would really brighten up the house. And just as we maybe simmer a potpourri or light a candle, that was the way that they could refresh their home with those wonderful scents that we associate with the holidays. But one of the things that I like to do in my own home that people have been doing for centuries is forcing Paperwhite bulbs. And the Paperwhite is a bulb flower. It's also known as the narcissus. And you can force those to bloom around the holidays, even through February. And it just is staggering when you do your plantings. So I'm going to take us out into the garden. I have a little potting area that my husband created for me a few years ago. And I'm going to show you how to prepare your bulbs. Now, I place my bulbs in pea gravel, and you can get that at most nurseries and home centers. Other people like to just simply use water in special glass vases. The beauty of preparing the bulbs in pea gravel is that I can stagger when I start adding the water, because once you start adding in the water, that's when the roots are going to start to grow and go down into the pea gravel. And it's generally around 3 to 4 weeks from the time that I start it that then they bloom. So if I start it Thanksgiving week, this year, then around the end of the first week of December, I'll have some beautiful blooms. And so I actually do about, probably 8 to 10 different containers. And then the following week, I'll start adding water to those bulbs so that I actually have beautifully blooming Paperwhites that are so wonderfully fragranced through the new year. So let's head out into the garden and get started. have enjoyed this week's Prairie Wonderland episode. And if by chance you make a mammoth pumpkin pie or start to force your own Narcissus Paperwhites, I would love to hear about it. You can always contact me through direct messaging at Instagram or on my website, and I will link to both those sites down below in the description box. You're also welcome to leave a comment down below this video. When you leave a comment or you hit the thumbs up video, it helps the video to gain in popularity and be enjoyed by more people. So that's always greatly appreciated. If you'd like to be notified of future videos, there is a subscribe button in the lower hand corner that you can just click on. As always, thank you so much for joining me this week, and I hope you have a very happy Thanksgiving.